Okay, so hopefully somebody joins throughout the workshop, but if not, it's recorded, so that's great. So today we're very happy to welcome Inga Gegužė. She's currently pursuing a politics and sociology degree at Newcastle University alongside a law degree at Vilnius University, so impressive. She's like a very esteemed and very loved debate alumni. And she's going to give you a lot of good insights into states, nations, and international organizations. So take note because it's going to be a great workshop. And I give the floor to Inga. Thank you.
Great, thanks for having me today. So we're going to start the workshop. Before we go on into sort of the content, a couple of caveats. So firstly, it's like intermediate to advanced level workshop. So obviously everyone is welcome. So if you have any questions, please, you can stop me, raise your hand, like text in the chat, ask questions. If, I speak too fast, as debaters do also, please do tell me. Also, we're going to be talking about states, nations, and international organizations as sort of subjects of international law. So, sort of to clarify, obviously, we're going to cover some basics on how to debate international organizations, but we're going to not like cover every type of international organization. We're going to focus more on like UN, we're going to focus on EU, NATO, and we are also going to talk about courts because I think they are sort of most relevant to the topic of states and nations in the debate, right? But we're not going to cover like most of like economic and organizations and whatnot. So that's sort of the scope of what we are going to do today. So to start, I think it's important to think that all of the actors that we're going to talk about here that is states, nations, and international organizations are like subject to international public law. So like as a result, I think it's important to understand sort of few key traits of international law. We're not gonna go into like details, but I think it sort of shows the relationship these subjects have with each other. So firstly, there is lack of like universal legislative power, right? So UN or any other international organization does not have a legislative function. There is no world government that passes laws that everyone then have to like abide by, right? Like even the sort of UN General Assembly can only adopt resolutions with sort of recommendatory power, right? So international law is generally not created by legislation, it's created usually by international agreements. So, I just put a motion here, which says this House prefers a world where the dominant norm was international organizations held actual legislative power over countries, right? But it's totally different international system that we will be talking about in this case, right? Secondly, there is also a lack of centralized executive power. So there is no international body, including like UN Security Council, that has like a centralized function of enforcing power. There is no world military, there is no world police, right? So the Security Council can have some binding decisions, right? It can like sanction the use of power in some cases, but it has a very limited scope essentially of like ensuring peace and security in the world. It does not concern itself with other matters of international law. But also, Security Council in particular is a political body, right? It's not a legal body, and decisions are often like a result of like political processes and compromises rather than, necessarily the best way to ensure like peace and security in the world. Thirdly, there is lack of judicial body as well with a general binding competence, right? So there is no one court to which you can go if you have an issue with another state, for example. Like International Court of Justice is the main judicial body of the UN. However, its jurisdiction is optional. We're going to talk about more about jurisdictions, of course, later. But basically, International Court of Justice only has the jurisdiction, meaning they can only sort of hear out cases between the states to if the states agreed for their case to be heard in the court, right? If the state does not want to go to court, it does not have to, and there is nothing that can force the states to do that, frankly. Fourthly, I think there are sort of specific enforcement features when we talk about international law. So the system itself is decentralized and relations are horizontal, meaning in theory at least the states, are equal in the view of court, even though we obviously understand that some states have more international power than others. So, and also enforcement of international law is essentially a responsibility of the actors themselves. So if your state that is hurt by another state, it's your own responsibility to take actions. You can take countermeasures, you can sue the state, right? But there is no one that's necessarily gonna help you to do that, right? Because when we talk about criminal law, for example, in Lithuania, if you are sort of victimized by a crime, police is gonna take over and they're gonna do all of this process without you necessarily having to do much there other than maybe reporting a crime. Sometimes you don't even have to do that. International law, however, it is on the state itself to sort of take actions if they are sort of harmed by another actor. So that is sort of a brief sort of overview how we look at international law in general. Before we move on to nations, I think couple caveats that are important in debate specifically. So it's important to understand that international law reflects a very idealistic view of world and peace, where, all countries respect for human rights, respect civilian lives in conflict. And that is not how reality usually works, right? So in debates, you have to pay extra attention to prove why and how countries actually and international organizations care about principles of international law, care about human rights and whatnot. And generally the best strategy to do that is not to say that states care about international law because they're so good and moral. Instead, you have to explain the underlying sort of pressures that force states to act the way they do, right? So instead of saying that America cares about human rights because it's such a good and democratic country, you instead show how domestic pressures, i.e. citizens, for example, force politicians to act the way they act because of, they want to get reelected. You talk about the image America wants to uphold in international community and sort of all of these factors is instead of saying, states are good and they care about civilians and whatnot. Secondly, when we talk about UN especially, but international organizations in general, as I mentioned, that there is a very limited extent of the power they have. They have no legislative power necessarily, universal judicial power, or enforcement necessarily. So there is limited extent to which they actually can do without their own military and stuff. As a result, in debates, you have to stay critical of that, and understand that these organizations are always also extremely politicized and bureaucratic. So if you are arguing about UN or any other international organization, I think you have to be prepared to call out for its past ineffectiveness, and on the other hand, sort of prove while it might have failed to do some things in the past, it would be effective in this particular case, right? I think it's not strategic to pretend that these organizations always work, and you only have to prove that they work in this particular case that the motion is about, right? So that's enough about background, and it's enough about the caveats. We're gonna start to talk about nations. So nation is a large body of people united by a common descent, a history, culture, or language that are inhabiting a particular country or territory, right? So a nation is not synonymous with a state, right? A nation might live within a state, but also there are nations that do not have states. So Kurdish people are the world's largest nation that do not have their own country or state, right? You can see sort of in the map that if there was a state of Kurdistan, it would take parts of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran. But generally, because of how colonial borders were drawn, these people never got to have their own state. Roma people as well, they don't have their own state as well. There are also states in which more than one nation lives in. So, for example, Spain has a Spanish government, but there are also Catalonia in Spain who have the regional autonomy and have their own government, right? So that's sort of, I think, how nation and state is separated. When we talk about nations in debates, the most important, I think, aspect of a nation is the right to self-determination. So under international law, every nation has the right to determine its own political status freely without outside interference. That can be, to create a sovereign independent state, to merge with another state with a free will, or to choose any sort of other sort of political status. Also, under international law, nations have the right to choose their own path of economic, social, and cultural development, and to use their own natural wealth and resources. And so, under international law, like all of the other states have the duty to respect and promote and facilitate the exercise of the right of self-determination, right? So essentially to allow the self-determination of people in the colonies to not in any way sort of impede their exercise of self-determination. So I just put a motion here. In the event that China invades Taiwan, this House as US would militarily intervene. And how you could relate in theory the sort of right to self-determination is to explain that China, US in particular, has like the duty to promote every state's right to self-determination, including Taiwanese people, and that is why, and explain why US would be a good agent to actually ensure this right. On the other hand, you also have to be realistic that the US also doesn't care about other states' right to self-determination. They don't care, for example, about Palestinians people right to self-determination. So in this case, it might be more strategic to actually not talk about this principle because it would be sort of quite hard to explain why US cares about this principle and talk about more US practical sort of incentives to protect Taiwan and whatnot. So secession. Secession is one way nations can exercise the right to self-determination. So secession is a process of a nation breaking away from another state and essentially becoming independent. So Lithuania seceded from USSR. Texas seceded from Mexico at some point, right? So essentially, when a nation does not want to be a part of a state, they essentially break up and exercise the right to be their own independent state. When we talk about secession as a way, as a part of self-determination, we see how the principle of self-determination can clash with other principles. That is the principle of territorial integrity and the principle of inviolability of national borders. Essentially, it sounds like complicated, but it essentially talks about the same thing, that, there is sort of, states have the right to their own territory and to their own borders. So under international law, right, the principle of self-determination does not necessarily permit or encourage any actions that would harm like states' territorial integrity or like political unity, provided, which is important, that the state respects and observes the principle of self-determination of peoples, and therefore has like a government that represents all of the inhabitants of the state without distinction as to religion, race, culture, and whatnot. So it can sound a bit complicated, but I'm gonna give you like an example of motion to understand how this can look like, right? So this motion says, assuming divisibility, this House as California would secede from the United States. So from the proposition, if we think about the principle of self-determination and secession, we have to prove that California is a nation or something similar to a nation. So they have distinct culture, and I don't know, you have to talk about avocado toast or whatever is Californian culture. And then you have to prove that US does not respect California's as a nation right to self-determination, that US does not allow them to have autonomy, that like it does not allow them to have their own government, essentially to prove how US is oppressing California, right? And in that case, the people's right to self-determination sort of goes above, the territorial integrity of the United States at the point at which the state is like oppressive to the nation, to this particular smaller nation that lives within it. So generally, something you have to do in any debate when you are proposing any type of action or reform is to prove urgency. That, California is being harmed by being in United States in this case, right? So that's about the nations and sort of agents, international law, and agents in debates. Now, so states. So state is essentially an independent autonomous political structure over a specific territory with a comprehensive legal system and essentially enough of a concentration of power to keep order within this territory. So state essentially is a like political and legal concept, whereas nation is sort of a psychocultural concept. So what makes a state? There are sort of different ways to sort of understand what are important criteria of a state, but I chose here to put material criteria and immaterial criteria, which is material criteria is the population, territory, and government that has like an effective control over the citizens in the territory. And immaterial traits are, the capacity to establish relationships with other states and also like independence and sovereignty. So states monopolize certain functions within its territory. So they control legitimate use of force. They, give the right to the police or to the military. If they're inviting another like country's military, you still have to give them permission to be there in the first place, right? It also controls money, usually at a national scale. It makes rules within a territory, i.e. law, different regulation establishing citizenship and things like that, and controls information within its territory as well. So, as I said, a nation and a state can exist separately, right? Nation can exist without a state, but when the two coincide, essentially, when the boundaries of a state are approximate to the boundaries of the nation, we call that a nation state. A nation state, in other words, is a nation that possesses political sovereignty. It is like cohesive and politically organized. And when we talk about nation states, right, we know that a certain level of national consciousness existed before the country, before the state existed. So we know that like Lithuanians as a nation, as peoples, existed and identified themselves as Lithuanians before the legal political concept of Lithuania was established, right? That is why we call Lithuania a nation state. Kind of the contrary to nation state is state nation. I understand that it can be a bit confusing because there are too many words here, but a state nation is a state where multiple nations existed at some point in the territory of a state. And it is a state in which the common identity of it was established after a political community was established, right? So for example, in France, we had like the monarchical political state established first, and only then the people who lived in the borders that were drawn came together and began to think of themselves as French people. So I think it's sort of interesting to understand that state nations are more common to like non-Western world, right? So many of them came to exist as a result of colonial projects, right? So when Western colonial powers drew borders in their colonial territories, they sort of disregarded the actual people and tribes that lived there, right? So they did not necessarily draw the borders as sort of people naturally live there, but they sort of drew the borders the way it was useful for them. So, for example, India is a state nation, and there was no single idea of India until British demarcated the borders of it, right? People who lived in the territory identified themselves as Tamils, Urdu speakers, Hindus, and only after the borders were drawn, they started to identify as like the Indian nation, right? So that's why I put this map here. If you see the map of Africa compared to the map of Europe, you see way more straight lines, right? And sort of sharp corners, which sort of reflects that probably these countries that have these sharp sort of borders are state nations, because that is not how populations naturally live and spread, right? This is how you drew borders on a map and then sort of force people within those borders to live. And then, they might create the common identity because they were sort of confined within these borders, right? So one of the motion I found about this was this house regrets the rise of nation states built around exclusive notions of language, race, and religion. I think I've debated this once myself when I was a wee debater. So that is all about have to say about state nations and nation states. But another aspect that is important when we talk about states is the state recognition, right? So state recognition is an act of one state recognizing another new state as like a newly created subject of international law. So it's an act that establishes, that there now is a political organized community within this territory, and they can now sort of be members of the international community and have like international obligations and things like that. State recognition, however, is not always synonymous with the recognition of a government, right? And recognition of a government specifically is an act of the state recognizing a particular authority within a state as capable of sort of representing peoples that live there, right? So in most cases, right, when you recognize a new state, you also recognize its new government, right? Usually, when one state is already recognized, like, I don't know, United Kingdom is a recognized state, and once a new British government is elected, you don't have to once again to re-recognize it, right? We assume, that new British government is legitimate government, and states do not have to sign separate acts to prove it, right? The question of recognizing government separately from the state comes in sort of exceptional circumstances, usually re-establishment of independence after occupation, or in cases of civil conflict, when there are multiple groups that are claiming authority within a particular territory, right? So, for example, when Lithuania regained independence in 1990, there was other countries did not recognize Lithuania as a state necessarily, because Lithuania was recognized as a state before it was occupied, and this recognition did not disappear because of occupation. Instead, what other states do is recognize a new Lithuanian government as now a legitimate authority within the territory, right? What is sort of common in other cases is that there are sort of few groups that are fighting within a civil conflict. So what the international community has to do is to say, well, we recognize this one particular group as an authority, and we're gonna, create a dialogue with this particular group because we recognize them as the government of the state, right? So an example of this would be the motion. This House believed that it's in the interest of international community to recognize as Hamas as the legitimate government of Palestine, right? Because in Palestine, we have separate groups that are sort of fighting for power, right? So it's sort of international community has to decide whether they recognize any government, and if they do, what specific group they're recognizing, and what sort of consequences does it necessarily bring. That's all about the recognition. Before I move on, we're going to talk about the right of self-defense. Does anyone have any questions? Cool. So, states' rights of self-defense. So, I think if you are sort of familiar with the principles of self-defense when you talk about individual people, it's sort of quite easy to understand. But essentially, under international law, every state has inalienable right to exercise the right of self-defense, right? Which includes the right to use or threaten to use force in the event of and to repel an armed attack, including preparedness to attack with nuclear weapons, the use of force motivated by political demands against the state agents or citizens. It also includes hybrid attacks or cyber attacks as well. And it's also acts of terrorism committed by non-state actors from abroad. So what you see here, that is, I find quite interesting, that after 9/11, like the doctrine of self-defense was expanded to include the defense against terrorist attacks, right? Because before 9/11, you could not, if you experience a terrorist attack by a non-state actor, you could not attack another state, right? Because it was not necessarily their doing, but rather a group within them, right? However, this doctrine was then expanded, meaning that in a case of large enough of terrorist attack, even if it was done by a non-state actor, the country had the right to invade another country to protect themselves. However, notice that very interestingly, this doctrine only allows to defend itself against external terrorist attacks, right? And not the attacks that come from within the country. So that is why, when we talk about the wall that was built separating Israel and Palestine, and sort of some of the attacks that Israel had on Palestine before, like October 7th, this wall was deemed illegal by international court, even though Israel said that they were defending themselves against terrorist attacks, because Palestine is like an essentially occupied territory under which Israel has control, meaning the threat to Israel came from inside. It was not an external threat, and that is why they were not able to use this legal justification for the wall that they built. So that is that. Okay, I missed a couple of slides anyway. So there are two forms of self-defense, and that is individual, meaning an attacked state is defending itself. And there is also collective, meaning the attacked state is assisted by others, right? So like NATO can help a NATO member that was attacked. An important criteria here is, however, that an attacked state has to ask for help, right? So, Russia cannot just send a military to a random country and said, oh, they asked for our help, right? Unless, they actually do that. And in debates are sort of two most important criteria that we use to justify self-defense. Firstly, it is necessity and urgency, meaning, the force is the only way to resolve the sort of situation, the only immediate way to help, an attacked country. There is no other action you can do to protect themselves. Secondly, it is like proportionality, meaning that the force you use to defend itself is sort of proportional in terms of scale and duration, and you're not using more force than it is necessary to repel the attack. And in principles, in theory, you also have to, comply with other principles of like just war. So you cannot like target civilians, use weapons of like mass destruction and things like that. But states don't always care about these like principles of just war. But I think, as you can see here, like necessity and proportionality, generally you use necessity and proportionality to justify, frankly, anything in debates, any action, reform, and like policy, right? So, like if we had a motion that was totally unrelated to like self-defense, For example, this house would remove all patents on green technology. You still would use necessity and proportionality to justify this, right? You would say, look, there is a necessity for green technology. We're in a climate crisis, we are burning. This is the only way that can help us, which is necessity. But secondly, because we are in this crisis, this response is proportional because the benefits we can have from this green technology is much sort of higher than the harm we do, for example, for like the businesses who own the patent technology. So necessity and proportionality you use generally in any type of justification. There are also sort of criteria and sort of procedural requirements for the legality of self-defense in international law, but you don't necessarily have to use that in debates. But in theory, you as an attacked state, you have to report the attack to the UN Security Council. You have to inform the UN Security Council about the self-defense measures you're taking. And self-defense can only take place until the Security Council, takes necessary measures to sort of resolve the situation. At least under international law theory, if you don't do this, it is not considered legitimate use of self-defense. And so motions that would, be sort of relevant to this would be, assuming feasibility and with benefit of hindsight, this house, as US, would go back in time and choose not to invade Afghanistan. So we, as we talked about the exercise of the rights of self-defense because of a terrorist, no, it's not. Anyway, against like a terrorist threat. Another motion would be this house as Japan would remove Article 9 from its constitution. So, Japanese constitution outlaws the use of war as a means to settle international disputes. And so it does not allow them to have a military. So essentially, Japanese sort of self-defense forces are extension of their police. Because after the World War II, essentially, US said to Japan, you demilitarize and we're gonna sort of protect you. But now there are questions to what extent Japan can rely on US as a protection and to which extent they should have the capacity to, defend themselves. So that is all I have to do to say about the states, and we are going to move on to talking about international organizations. Does anyone have any questions here? Great. So yeah, there are different types of international organizations and there are different ways to classify them. So we can classify intergovernmental and non-governmental international organizations. We can classify them based on geographical sphere, activity. For example, we have universal organizations such as UN, we have like regional, like AU and things like that. We can classify them by procedure of admission and like nature of membership. Like there are open organizations such as UN, but there are like closed, such as NATO, for example. And there are sort of, sorry, I see a message. The question is, how do you beat the self-defense principle? Well, if you want to essentially explain why this principle was illegitimate, in a sense that, this did not constitute such a high necessarily, the terror threat was not such a high threat to justify the invasion of another sovereign country. But in this debate, I would actually not necessarily try to defeat the principle. I would take it on practicalities to explain, we had now we know how, how they sort of withdrew from Afghanistan. And actually, the situation in Afghanistan is now worse, frankly, than when they invaded. So, and because this motion says with benefits on hindsight, from current perspective, you see how sort of badly it sort of ended up. So in this case, I would say you could sort of explain why, the self-defense that was exercised was not proportional, the threat was not such a necessarily high, and things like that. But even if US had the right to invade Afghanistan, like practically it was a horrible decision, and you should not have like made it in the first place. Is it clear? I hope it's clear. Cool. Right. So when we talk about international organizations, we have to understand why they are important. Is generally we sort of explain that in debates, because international organizations enable us to resolve issues that require a large-scale solutions, that require state cooperation, and that require what we call mutual state reassurance. Meaning, for example, to solve a climate change, we need, for states to cooperate, we need everyone to actually like do their part. But states have to sort of know that other states are also doing, the same reforms. For example, if like I as a state want to move towards green energy, I know that this is gonna harm my economy because like coal is cheaper. And if other states are not doing that, then it's very hard for me to sort of like compete in their national market. But if everyone is doing that, then everyone is sort of like taking a bit of harm to their economy, and then it doesn't like affect me so much necessarily. So that is what is like mutual state reassurance, that we all are doing this together, and we all sort of facing some of the like consequences here. So how do international organizations exert their power? So there are different sanctions by member states or international organizations such as UN, and that includes like freezing assets and not allowing people to travel, and like limits on like export and trade, and things like that. This can look like denying memberships to a state, or denying like funding and support. And there are also international courts to which you can sue a state if they're breaking their like they're not like fulfilling their obligations. Why do states comply with like international organizations? Is because of internal political pressures. They wanna be elected, or they don't wanna face like scrutiny and things like that. There are diplomatic consequences, how other countries will look at you and sort of behave towards you. And also there are sort of corresponding rights of the states. So basically, if you know that in the future, as a state, in the future, you might want to, like, for example, sue another state, probably when you are sued, you are gonna like recognize the court that is suing you and maybe like try to engage in the process, because if you don't, then in the future you cannot like exercise this right? So basically, you have to respect other states' rights if you want yourself to exercise a particular right as well, right? Well, at least sort of that's like internal logic, that doesn't always necessarily work out in practice. So when you sort of debate international organizations, there are sort of like identified 4 questions that you have to ask yourself. Like, what is the purpose of the international organization? 2, what are the principles of the international organization? 3, what duties the international organization have to their own member states? And 4, what duties the international organization has to external like actors, external countries, and things like that. So, for example, we have a motion. This House believes that European Union should institute a common army. Like the way you are able to debate this, very much depends on how you frame the purpose of the EU. If you frame from opposition, for example, as like the main goal of EU to ensure economic cooperation, then maybe common army is not really a good choice for EU. if you frame the purpose of EU as, one that to protect democracy and security for member states and to sort of promote democratic values and things like that, maybe a common army is not such a bad idea. So it depends, you obviously always frame it biasly to be helpful to your own side. Yeah, so that is sort of on the general notes on international organizations. And as I said, we are not going to be able to cover all of them. We're going to focus, as I said, on the EU, NATO, UN, and we're going to talk a bit about the courts because it's my area of interest, at least. And it sometimes, happens in debates as well. Starting from EU, right? So it's sort of a very unique type of organization, and it's an economic and political union of 27 European countries. So it is considered one of a kind organization. No other organization has such a high level of integration. Because member states have surrendered so much of their power and rights to the EU. So sort of their main aims of the EU are peace and stability, economic integration and single market, social and regional cohesion, meaning sort of create, reduce disparities, social and economic, sort of in the region and among the citizens, and to ensure that everyone sort of benefits from the development and the prosperity. Also, democratic values and the rule of law, sustainable development, and also global influence, not global development. So mistake here. There are 7 European institutions, that is European Parliament, the European Council, the European Commission, the Court of Justice of the European Union, the European Central Bank, and sort of the Court of Auditors. So we are not going to go one by one because I think if you are interested that you don't need me to tell you, you can just Google and it's going to say what every of the international institution is going to say. We're going to talk about other relevant aspects of EU in debates, right? So there is sort of what we call a primacy of European Union law, meaning essentially that member states of the European Union need to ensure the primacy of the European Union uniformity and effectiveness in the application of Union law, which means national law cannot conflict with European Union law. So meaning member states have to abolish rules that conflict essentially with EU law. Even Lithuanian constitutionalists don't wanna agree necessarily that EU law is higher than Lithuanian constitution, but the fact it is if there was a conflict between a constitution and EU law, probably either Lithuania has to leave EU or change the constitution, right? There are sort of few mechanisms how EU laws are enforced. I put only a few here. There are sort of more of them, but I don't imagine it's going to happen anytime in debates. Firstly, there are political sanctions. So what we call a nuclear weapon sanction is codified in the Article 7 of the Treaty of the European Union, essentially which says that the Council, with a qualified majority, can decide to suspend the rights of relevant member states, including their voting rights and things like that, if they sort of break the values of the European Union of the Article 2. So, which includes democracy, rule of law, respect for human rights, and things like that. So I don't know if you heard, but the Article 7 procedure was started for, I think, Poland and Hungary, when Poland, for example, tried to attack the independent judiciary. It never went through to the full extent. Obviously Poland's rights were never suspended. But because they broke these sort of values, they sort of it was like political sanctions were started to be sort of enforced. There are sort of pre-litigation infringement procedures, which meaning sort of, they investigate and they say, oh, we give you this time frame to like fix this issue, and they set the conditions to the state to sort of do better, essentially. There are also like court procedures, that is like infringement procedure under Article 258, which means like European Commission essentially sues the member state. And like a result of it could be like financial sanctions, like if you found like of breaking like EU law, and also infringement procedure under Article 259, which is like one state can sue another member state for like infringing, which also results in financial sanctions. The thing is, there is no way to like ensure that that like fine is paid, or like that the state actually like changes anything. So also, when we talk about EU as like economic union, we talk about the single market, or sometimes called a common market, which includes the free movement of goods, free movement of services, free movement of capital, and free movement of persons. When it comes to like debate motions that I found about EU, a lot of it has to do with some like enlargement. For example, this house regrets the Eastern enlargement of the EU, which is, the enlargement in 2004 and 2007, which included Lithuania. And like this debate would concern on whether, like economically it is good for the Union, whether, EU like achieved, for example, their goal of sort of spreading the democratic values in the region. For example, whether it was able to sort of stop, the Russia's influence, for example, in the region, and things like that. Some motions are about the expansion of the EU, like North Macedonia and things like that. And generally, when we think about that, we think about what we call donor states, and sort of what's the opposite of donor state? I don't know, but the receiver sort of states. So essentially, whether a member state gives more money to the EU, or they get more money to the EU than they give, right? So, for example, when Lithuania sort of joined the EU, we got like loads of money from them to do all sorts of projects. But as we develop, we now pay more money to them necessarily than we receive, right? So if we sort of accept states to whom we have to like spend a lot of money, how all of the other member states like are going to react, and they don't want necessarily to sort of have their monies to go to like other like countries that are not going to necessarily always bring benefit to them back. Because when we think about some states, Lithuania, we've reached a point of development to which we can now give to others. But there are some countries that will never do that. They will always receive more money. For example, Greece, right? Because of their limited like agriculture and like dependence on like dependence on tourist sector, and they always get more money from the EU than they give. Like Luxembourg is such a small country that they receive more money than they give, right? Another motion that they found was about secession. So whether EU should guarantee membership to regions of existing member states such as Catalonia, Scotland, in case they secede, right? So it also relates to the right to whether EU should respect like Catalonia's and Scotland's right to self-determination, and whether this extends to them sort of guaranteeing membership to them, and sort of practical benefits and harms to the EU and member states as well. There are sort of motions about EU's army, whether EU should extend their scope as like security organization, whether EU member states can depend on NATO and things like that, as well as sort of this house as the EU would form European Federation, whether European Federation would be essentially one country of the European Union, and sort of like states would not be individual countries, but would have some autonomy, essentially, whether EU should integrate more, whether their countries should give more rights to the EU, or whether it's too much, whether other countries should like essentially keep some more of their own sovereignty like to them. So that's what I have to say about EU before we move on to NATO. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, cool. So NATO shortly. The purpose of NATO is protection of what they say liberty and other common values of the Union. Their objective is to enhance the stability and prosperity in the North Atlantic region, and also like to have collective defense to safeguard like peace and security. So there are sort of like essentially two larger institutions within NATO, that is North Atlantic Council, and it's like subsidiary bodies, which is like civilian like structure, and there is also military committee and like subordinate military bodies, which is the military like structure. When we talk about Article 5, usually we think about Article 5. When we talk about NATO, we think about Article 5, which is essentially that all like members agree that an armed attack against one of them is considered an attack against all of them. And like if such attack occurs, all of the countries have the duty to assist the attacked party. Which can include the use of like armed force and things like that. Yeah, so I think similar emotions concern NATO as similar emotions are with NATO and EU. So about new member states, whether Ukraine should be joining. Are like, for example, there is also motion I found this house would as NATO covertly support separatist movements in Russia, as whether the goal of ensuring peace and stability includes like supporting separatist groups in another country, or whether it's overstepping the boundaries of like what NATO seeks to do and things like that. And whether that would like harm the relations with Russia if they found out, can be found out, and things like that. Moving on to United Nations. So United Nations, the objective of United Nations is to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations between the states, to implement international cooperation solving like different problems, that is economic and humanitarian problems, to promote and develop respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and sort of to act sort of a main point of connection of national action in pursuit of like joint objectives. There are 5 institutions. There is General Assembly, just 193 members, which General Assembly issues recommendations. There is Security Council, which has 5 permanent members that have a power of veto, which is China, Russia, France, UK, and US. There is International Court of Justice. There is Economic and Social Council, and there is like Secretariat. So the Security Council has primary but not exclusive responsibility for ensuring the national peace, and they make legally binding decisions. General Assembly deals with issues of international cooperation and makes non-legally binding recommendations. So basically, the Security Council has sort of unique responsibilities and activities. To sort of ensure the peace and security, and there are sort of, as I said, the veto power that permanent member states have. Essentially, there is no substantive limit to the powers of the Security Council. The only limit is sort of under international law that Security Council can take all of the measures necessary to achieve those objectives. So their only power is limited by the objectives that they are trying to achieve. why Security Council is important is essentially Security Council has like a specific power to sanction the use of force when it considers that the peace is threatened or disturbed, and when an act of aggression is being committed. Like any other body does not have such power. So they can make like recommendations and decide on measures that are necessary to like maintain and restore like peace and security. If like peaceful measures are insufficient, and if Security Council thinks that they are insufficient, they can essentially say that we now allow the use of like military force or like blockades and like air, water, and land operations by UN members. That is sort of why sort of Security Council is sort of different from like many different bodies of the UN. Related to this is the what we call R2P, or the Right to Protect Doctrine of the EU. So essentially, international law says that each individual state has the responsibility to protect its own populations from genocide, war, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. So essentially, the right to protect is known as sort of international norm that seeks to ensure, that national community never again fails to like stop their mass atrocities of like genocide and war crimes and things like that. So this concept emerged in like 1990s, essentially after like the genocide in Rwanda and like mass atrocities in Yugoslavia as well. Essentially, so international community developed this concept as a response. So what happened essentially was that in the 1990s, like international community was very much criticized for like failing to intervene in the Srebrenica massacre and the Rwandan genocide, which like influenced the NATO's bombing of Kosovo later, right? Which was like in order to stop the sort of massacre of like Albanian Muslims by Serbian like military. So like NATO's intervention was deemed largely successful in preventing ethnic cleansing. However, it found like illegal but legitimate, right? Meaning it was not like codified under international law. So in order to sort of codify this sort of intervention, UN adopted the responsibility to protect doctrine, which means that UN is prepared to take collective action in a timely and like decisive manner. If like through the Security Council, if like peaceful measures are like inadequate and like local authorities are not able to protect their own citizens. However, sort of there have been issues with this doctrine. There was NATO intervention in Libya, which was not authorized by the Security Council, and it's sort of been argued that like R2P lost its like credibility, and also like R2P was not invoked in sort of in Yemen and Myanmar and Syria. So to what extent it's like realistically helpful is like debated. So humanitarian intervention is part of the R2P doctrine, which essentially says that you can use the force in another country without the sanction of the Security Council in order to protect the lives and fundamental rights of a large number of people from imminent danger, if the state that they are in is unwilling or unable to protect them. So essentially, the very humanitarian intervention fulfills the duty to protect. There are traits of, of humanitarian intervention that first, it is not sanctioned by the Security Council. It is sanctioned as like a different kind of use of force. The aim is to protect vulnerable people under the jurisdiction of another state because of violation of their fundamental rights. And, the state in which they are does not like fulfill their obligation in protecting its own people. As I said, there are sort of further justifications for that is like proportionality as well, which we use in any sort of international law debate, and also the absence of like self-serving objectives, right? Which means which means that, like, for example, Russia can try to say that they invaded Ukraine in order to protect Ukrainian population against their own government, but it's clear that they have a lot of self-serving objectives in this case. That's why it is not considered a humanitarian intervention here. The motions that we have about UN is, for example, that in extreme circumstances, this House would allow the United Nations peacekeeping forces to invade and hold the said territories as a protected territory of the United Nations. There is a motion from LSDA, I think a couple years ago. This House opposes the narrative that the international community has a responsibility to protect the populations of developing countries at risk of genocide, war, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity from their own state. Also, we consider about veto power, because obviously, if Russia has veto power, they can veto anything they don't like, or China, or US, right? And whether there should be no veto power, or other countries, like neutral countries, for example, should have veto power. And as I said, whether like General Assembly, which is considered to be a more democratic body of UN because there is no veto power and there are much more members, should be able to pass like legally binding resolutions rather than Security Council itself. So that's about the UN. Before we move on to the courts, does anyone have questions? Okay, so first is International Court of Justice. There are like 4 courts I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to talk about briefly, so like don't worry. ICJ is a part of UN, right? It's a UN institution, and it adjudicates disputes between the states. There is optional jurisdiction based on the parties, and parties have to consent to be in the jurisdiction. But if you are like a member of UN, you consent to this essentially, and decision is only binding for like the parties to the case. ICJ also like issues advisory opinions on interpretation of international law. However, one thing that you see, I have this picture of the sort of ICJ case on the application of the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip. You can see that it is a case of South Africa versus Israel. Why is that so? Well, firstly, Palestine is sort of not a member of the UN. It has some rights granted, but it is not like a full member. But secondly, you would ask why South Africa would bring this case, because South Africa is not the one that is like experiencing this like alleged crime from Israel, right? And the thing is that there is exceptional jurisdiction under the Genocide Convention, under which any country has the duty to act in a case of genocide and is able essentially to sue the aggressor, even if they themselves were not like the victim of the crime. That is why South Africa is doing this against Israel instead of Palestine. However, as with most international courts, ICJ has no real enforcement power, right? So ICJ can sort of implement some penalties if like the country is not abide by the ruling, but in theory at least you can like fine them and things like that, like put sanctions. UN can put sanctions on you, but there is sort of limit to what you can sort of force the state to do. So the motion I have here is that this House would grant the ICJ independent jurisdiction to implement penalties against the states that do not abide by the ruling. So whether ICJ should have like actual power, like enforcement power to enforce the rulings. There is also discussion of whether ICJ sort of doctrine should be expanded, and whether ICJ should also have the power to prosecute crimes against the earth as sort of a crime of like whether crimes against the earth is such a serious crime as well that ICJ should like care about. Okay, my voice is giving up. Okay, but we don't have much left, so it's fine. ICC, which is the International Criminal Court, prosecutes individuals against 4 types of crimes. That is war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and crimes against aggression. Meaning, essentially, ICC has the authority to prosecute any individual. It does not prosecute countries who is a national of one of the states that have signed the Rome Treaty, or prosecute a crime that occurred in a soil of a nation that is a signatory. So, for example, US, for example, commits a crime in US is not a signatory, which is interesting. Commits a crime in Afghanistan, who is a signatory, you can in theory prosecute US citizens for that. ICC in theory, only in reality also, only prosecutes people if the status they are from is unwilling or unable to prosecute them. But realistically, if your own leader is committing a crime, you're probably not going to prosecute them. And it's sort of very hard for the state to prosecute their own citizens for their own military intervention, right? However, there has been a lot of critique of the ICC. One of them is that, from 2002, which is 3 years, ICC has convicted 11 people and acquitted 4, which is such a ridiculously small number that, we have this whole institution that has done so relatively little. There are also sort of challenges that, some countries can just withdraw from the Treaty of Rome if they don't want to be prosecuted, right? There is nothing that will hold you there. There are some difficulties with extradition, meaning, in theory, if you are a signatory, you have the right to extradite a person who is in your territory, but not all countries do that. And so also ICC has been accused of bias and sort of viewed as racist by the African Union, because majority of cases have been about African states and crimes that happened there. However, this has changed in a couple of recent years with Russia and being arrest order being issued for Putin, I think, and Netanyahu as well. So motions about ICC, I think, is the main court that we talk about in debates. Motions would be this house believes that war criminals should be tried in their home countries instead of ICC, which concerns whether it gives a better sense of justice. Can they receive unbiased trial or not, and things like that. On which side victims feel better and things like that. This house believes that ICC should hire mercenaries to capture indicted individuals and put them on trial at Hague. So this concerns extradition and the fact that you cannot force anyone to go to the court and be convicted of a crime. Another court is last court that I want to talk about is the European Court of Human Rights. It is not part of the EU. It's part of the sort of what's called. I'm sorry. It's Council of Europe, which is separate institution from separate organization from the EU, which was established when the sort of Convention of Human Rights was signed, in order and the main purpose of the Council of Europe is sort of to protect human rights in the region. So there is this particular body, the European Courts of Human Rights, which essentially aims to protect human rights in the region, and individuals can complain to the court, or groups of individuals, companies, NGOs, and also states. However, the priority of ECHR is to reach a peaceful settlement, not necessarily bring justice. The execution of court's final judgment is supervised by what we call the Committee of Ministers. So in theory, they can say you didn't pay the fine, to the states that, for example, that have been found guilty of something. But as I said, all of the courts have like limited power to enforce the rulings. The only sort of sanction that could be like a hard sanction would be sort of to remove country from the Council of Europe, but that's never been applied in practice. However, there's sort of what I find interesting is sort of when European Court of Human Rights considers whether a specific restriction of human rights by a country has been legitimate, they have to answer three questions. And what I personally particularly like, that the logic they use to justify certain actions in like court and like legal sphere is very similar to the way we justify different actions in debates, right? So they have to answer three questions essentially, the court. Did the human rights restrictions pursue a lawful aim? Meaning, were the human rights restrictions codified in a legislation and not like in some separate act of like a president? Secondly, did the human rights restrictions pursue a legitimate aim? Meaning, whether the aim was good and like valuable, like important and things like that, and whether the human rights restrictions proportional. So, in debates, we don't necessarily talk about whether something is lawful, but we talk about whether the aim of restriction is good and important, and whether it is proportional, right? So, for example, if we talk about one of most recent cases against Lithuania in European Court of Human Rights, that was a case against Lithuania, which was a case of, if you heard the book called Gintarinė širdis, it's a children's story book that talks about same-sex couples. The court tried to answer the question that whether the banning of this book was lawful, and it was because it was done under the law of the protection of minors. Secondly, they asked whether the human rights restrictions pursued a legitimate aim, and that's where the court said no. They said the aim of this restriction was to essentially suppress positive information about queer people, which is not a legitimate aim. So then they did not talk about the proportionality because the aim was not legitimate in the first place, then the restrictions cannot be proportional. So that is sort of, I think, this logic is sort of something you should try to apply when you're writing cases debates. There are specific questions that you can answer, such as necessity, proportionality, legitimacy of the aim, that sort of allows you to justify, frankly, anything you want. Yeah, so basically that is it that I have prepared for today. If there are any questions, you're welcome to ask or, comment on the post. I will see and answer and things like that. Yeah, so thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and have a nice day.
Thank you, Inga.